It is a profound pleasure for me to introduce Deborah Weiss, Esquire, who's proud to say an adjunct scholar for the Endowment for Middle East Truth and works for Vigilance Incorporated, an organization dedicated to educating the public on national security and terrorism-related issues. Ms. Weiss is a speaker and contributor to many, many publications, too numerous to mention, on the subject of radical Islam, free speech, and various United Nations resolutions. Ms. Weiss herself is a survivor of September 11th. Thank you very much, Deborah.
Pardon? Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today and for all of you for coming. Please bear with me if I speak a little quickly. I have a lot to cover, plus I'm from New York, so. So who is the Organization of Islamic Conference, or the OIC? It is the second largest international organization in the world, behind only the UN. It is the largest Islamic organization in the world. It's comprised of 56 member states plus the Palestinian Authority, and they claim to represent 1.5 billion Muslims around the world. As Sarah mentioned, they recently changed their name to the Organization of Cooperation this June, but their mission remains identical to what it was before, and I'll let you decide whether or not they're cooperating, and if so, with whom. Saudi Arabia's role with the OIC is it was one of the founding members, one of the largest financial backers and funders, and for that reason, it is also one of the most influential members in terms of determining the agenda of the OIC and what direction it takes. It plays a big role in deciding which issues the OIC will address and the positions it'll take on those issues. Also, the OIC's headquarters are based in Saudi Arabia and Jeddah. The OIC's mission is to promote Islamic values, to revitalize Islam's pioneering role in the world, to unify the Muslim voice, and to support the quote-unquote Palestinian struggle. They tend to vote together as a bloc in the UN, and certainly in the Human Rights Council, they are the most powerful voting bloc that the Council has. Their charter claims that they promote peace, tolerance, and fight terrorism, but their actions are very dissonant with those claims. The OIC is an Islamist supremacist organization that seeks to have dominant political power and install Islam and deny freedom to anybody who doesn't want to live under Sharia law or Islamic law, including Muslims who don't want to live under Sharia law. Toward that end, they introduced resolutions into the United Nations which would stifle free speech, and their ultimate goal, were they to have their way, would be to criminalize speech on Islam, anything to do with Muslim theocracies, Sharia law, Islamic terrorism, or any related subjects. Knowing they can't achieve their goal overnight, they tend to target certain UN bodies, and now they're also targeting various EU parliaments and introduce the language in watered-down form in order to achieve their goals gradually and incrementally. So the first resolution that I'm going to discuss is called Combating Defamation of Religions, or Defamation of Religions for short. Initially, this resolution was titled Defamation of Islam, but when it failed to get sufficient support, they changed their name to Defamation of Religions. However, the text of the resolution still only mentioned Islam by name and no other religion. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the defamation of religions concept, what it does is it gives an idea, a religion, in this case Islam, protections from criticism rather than giving individuals protections from defamation. So you have defamation of a religion instead of defamation of individuals or groups of individuals. And as I said, were this one to be made binding law, it would outlaw all criticism of anything related to Islam. The resolution takes numerous assumptions and asserts them as fact. For example, without any debate, without any investigations, and without any hearings, it asserts that Islam is wrongly associated with human rights violations, it's wrongly associated with terrorism, and that there's been undue backlash against Muslims ever since 9/11. The resolution seeks to prohibit the distribution of, quote, xenophobic ideas and material aimed at any religion or its followers, unquote, and to prevent acts of hatred and defamation, especially as applied to Islam. Believe me, there is absolutely no reciprocity for anti-Jewish speech or anti-Israel speech. In fact, the OIC supports Hamas, it supports Iran's nuclear program, and it also rationalizes 9/11. For those of you who don't know much about UN resolutions, the legal status is they are not legally binding, but they do carry quite a lot of political clout. If they are passed repeatedly in various bodies of the UN, or certainly in a multitude of bodies, and especially if the similar language is also passed in EU parliaments, eventually the language embodied in that resolution could be deemed, quote unquote, customary international law. Were that to happen, then countries who never signed on to the resolution would be pressured to adhere to it. Some of the problems with the interpretation of this resolution are it comes dangerously close to outlawing hostility or hatred, which you might have noticed is an emotion. It tries to assert the defamation of religions as an international human right. The resolution tries to internationalize the standards of free speech. So in America, we have the First Amendment. Other countries have their rules on free speech. This resolution aspires to establish a single rule across the board which would supplant the rules of each country. The language of the resolution is vague and very likely to be given a broad construction by the most oppressive regimes. In fact, resolutions like this give credibility to Islamic blasphemy laws and tighten the noose around already oppressed minorities. All religions have an element of exclusivity in them. So for example, if you say, I believe Jesus is the Son of God, then by definition, that would be considered blasphemy to Islam, and under this resolution, it would also be defaming Islam. The timeline for this resolution is it was first introduced in 1999 into the then Commission on Human Rights. A similar resolution was introduced in 2005 into the General Assembly, and later, when the Human Rights Commission closed and popped up under the new name of the Human Rights Council, it was also introduced there in 2006. In all three of these bodies, this resolution was passed every single year subsequent to its initial introduction. In 2008, which was the first time that this resolution was in jeopardy of not getting passed. But the OIC did everything it could to make sure that it would, and launched an aggressive campaign that included holding 2 major summits on Islamophobia. There they established the existence of Islamophobia, stated that they would have a zero tolerance for it, that they were going to combat any free expression that criticized Islam that they deemed to be Islamophobic, including hostile glances. In 2000, and they were going to target cartoonists, film producers, reporters, and governments, and I think you can see they've done that. In 2008, at one of those summits, they also unveiled their first OIC Observatory on Islamophobia, which is now an annual report on alleged Islamophobic incidents, and they also have a monthly report. The first report was 58 pages of real, imagined, perceived, and claimed Islamophobia incidents, and the numbers of these reports that are repeated by the media often can be very alarming. So I took the first report and looked through it and was very surprised to find that about half the incidents listed were actually not bad things that non-Muslims were doing to Muslims, but bad things that Muslims were doing to non-Muslims. Well, how can this be? If you understand that the OIC's definition of Islamophobia includes accurate reports, the veracity of which are not in dispute, then you'll understand that merely reporting anything that sheds Muslims or Islam in a negative light is deemed Islamophobic. And I'll give you a few examples from that annual report. In 2008, the country of Qatar opened its first church, and there were riots on the street. Muslims were protesting. Arab papers were saying Christians should not have the right to build a house of worship in a Muslim country. One of those articles was translated into English and reproduced in a Western publication, and that reprinting is Islamophobic. It's also Islamophobic that Wikipedia refused to remove from their English language website depictions of their prophet Muhammad. That's very Islamophobic. And what's really, really Islamophobic is that the EU asked Iran to remove the death penalty for apostasy. These are the types of things listed in their Islamophobic reports and included in their Islamophobic statistics. The OIC repeatedly asserts that Islamophobia is one of the greatest causes to the threat to world peace and global security, rather than concluding that perhaps Islamophobia is the result of the actions taken by a radical Islamic movement around the globe. As a result of this OIC Islamophobia victimhood campaign, because that's exactly what it was, the resolution passed yet again in 2008, but with declining support. Subsequently, the HRC, the Human Rights Council, instituted a rule that said you cannot, quote unquote, judge or evaluate a religion. Therefore, any human rights violations that result from Sharia law, such as stonings, beheadings, hanging of homosexuals, forcing 9-year-old girls to get married, were no longer allowed to be considered in the Human Rights Council, the body which was purportedly designed to consider human rights violations around the world. Now, last year I discussed at length another resolution which was introduced and passed in 2009 called Freedom of Opinion and Expression. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go over that one at all today. I think there's something over there about it, but suffice it to say that this resolution was written by the Obama and Mubarak administrations in conjunction with each other, and it would also have the effect of clamping down on free speech on Islam, and were it to pass, were it to be made binding law, it's in complete contravention to the United States First Amendment. And if it were ever deemed customary international law, the United States would have trouble exempting themselves since we were one of the co-sponsors. And that's all I can say about it now. Now, the most current resolution that I want to talk about is a new resolution that was just passed in March of 2011 called Resolution 1618 to combat intolerance based on religion or belief. The background of this resolution is, as I said, there was declining support for the defamation of religions resolution, because people started to catch on. It would stifle free speech and various other reasons. And so at the behest of the State Department, they drafted it was the OIC, the US, and the EU drafted this resolution. Why the State Department thought it was their job, I don't know. But this is the first time in 12 years that the OIC did not introduce the defamation of religions resolution into the UN. So this new resolution passed in March, and the State Department, as well as many Christian organizations and other organizations, are touting it as a huge success because supposedly it's moving from the combating defamation of religions concept to the protection of individuals. So isn't that really great? It would be really great if it were true, but is it? Let's take a look more closely at the language. It certainly omits the word defamation from the text of the resolution and focuses instead on, quote, intolerance, negative stereotyping, and incitement to violence based on religion or belief, unquote, especially as applied to Islam. And that latter part, by the way, isn't in dispute. Everybody knows that the reason this resolution was drafted was in part to address the OIC's concerns about alleged Islamophobia. It seeks to eliminate intolerance and hatred, which, as I said before, are emotions. Now, this next part, please pay attention to the language. It condemns, quote, advocacy of religious hatred that amounts to incitement to hostility and violence, unquote, and requests governments to act to prevent it. So the issue is going to be, how are they defining incitement? And there is ample reason to believe that criticism of a religion, in other words, defamation of Islam, will constitute the advocacy of hatred that amounts to the legally prohibited violence. It also condemns programs and agendas pursued by extremist groups aimed at perpetuating these negative stereotypes. Who are these extremist groups? Yes, exactly. You are looking at them. We are the extremist groups, and the OIC talks quite a lot about right-wing groups that do just that. And this is also very important. It makes religious profiling illegal, not condemns it, not notes with concern, it makes it illegal for purposes of national security and law enforcement. So how are they defining religious profiling? Quote, the invidious use of religion as a criterion to conduct investigations, questioning, searches, and investigation, unquote. So please note, they're not saying that you can't use religious profiling as the sole criterion. No one wants to say, oh, you're Muslim, let's profile you. They're saying you can't even consider it as a factor in a list of other elements to consider. Additionally, this resolution asserts a moral equivalency among all religions and belief systems. Communism, fascism, freedom, democracy, oh, really? They're all the same. They're all the same, unless, of course, you're a right-wing Islamophobe like we are. Other than that, they're all the same. And now they've thrown in the word culture as well, so all cultures are equal. Basically, what this resolution does is it replaces defamation of religion language it does replace it with European hate-style speech language. But it still retains the same goal of achieving defamation of Islam goals in the view of the OIC, and we'll talk a little more about how I know that later. Hillary Clinton this summer announced that the State Department was going to host a series of meetings starting this fall in Washington to move to implementation of this resolution. It's not required in the resolution, but that's what they've decided to do. So, how has the OIC interpreted this? The OIC has expressly stated that they will use this as a platform to pressure Western governments to regulate speech on behalf of Islam. They expect to develop a legal framework of the resolution that will help enact laws which will, quote, prevent incitement of hatred, the emotion, based on, you guessed it, defamation of religions. So they're letting you know in very clear terms that they have not dropped the defamation of Islam concept. The OIC's recommendations, as stated in one of the most recent OIC Islamophobia reports, includes removing the gaps in interpretation of international law in order to criminalize, not just make it legal, but to criminalize acts of incitement to hatred. So, if Pakistan has one definition of incitement and America has another, I'll let you guess which definition they're going to push for in removing those gaps of interpretation. The OIC has stated that, and the issue here again is going to be what's the definition of incitement? They have stated that they want to use a test of consequences rather than a content-based test. So what they're talking about, for those of you who don't know, in America, for example, we do have a law against incitement to violence. If I say, oh, I really hate Joe, and you should all get together tomorrow and kill him, and you do that, you'll be responsible for murder, but I'll still be responsible for my comment inciting violence, and that's illegal. But if I say, on the other hand, I really hate Joe, he's stupid, he's ugly, I can't stand him, but I don't tell you to kill him, and then tomorrow you go out and you kill him, that's on you, because I'm entitled to say my opinion. In the American law, that's not the OIC's view. The OIC very often uses as an example of incitement, they use the example of the Danish cartoons. And if you remember, a few years back, there were a series of cartoons depicting their prophet Muhammad in a negative light, and subsequently, there were riots all across the Middle East and Denmark. The embassy was trashed, people were killed, and they would say that was incitement to violence. But I think a lot of you in this room would agree with me when I say that the rioters chose to react in that fashion. If you have a Judeo-Christian value of personal responsibility, where does the responsibility lie? Does it lie with someone who says something that you just happen to find offensive? Or does it lie with the people who chose to react that way? Why is it that, sorry, microphone. Why is it that when there was a cross put in urine, there were no riots? Why is it that when cow dung was thrown on a painting of the Virgin Mary in the Brooklyn Museum of Art, Christians didn't go rioting, causing mayhem, killing people, trashing property. Instead, they wrote op-eds, letters to the editor, letters to Giuliani, asking him, please don't give taxpayer dollars supporting this museum. So that's how they're going to define it. And notice also, it's consequence, it was subsequently, not consequently, in my view. And their final goal, they say, is to, quote unquote, eradicate all manifestations of Islamophobia. So if that's their goal, it's very important to know how they're defining Islamophobia. And I found in a Turkish publication that Secretary General of the OIC, his exact definition is, quote, any anti-Islam or anti-Muslim attitude or activity, unquote. So see, he's not just talking about violence, he's not just talking about discrimination, and you might have noticed he's not even just talking about speech, but any attitude or thought as well. General tips for analyzing the OIC resolutions is to pay attention to the language and how they're defining their terms. They tend to have certain patterns. One of them is they conflate various ideas together. They can tend to conflate violence with speech, with action, with emotion or hatred. Should we criminalize that? They tend to conflate race with religion. If you're Islamophobic, you're racist. What race is Islam? They redefine words. In America, slander or defamation has to be a false statement. In their definition, it just has to be something that they don't like, even if it's true. Freedom of speech doesn't include freedom of blasphemy. Defamation of religion means defamation of Islam, not defamation of Judaism. And the Obama administration, who keeps saying that they want to work with the OIC toward mutual respect, that sounds really great until you know that the OIC's definition of respect is that you should shut up if you're saying anything that they find offensive. The process is, I just want to say quickly, the process, and then I'll wrap up. Sorry, I could just go on and on, but I'll just try to wrap up. In America, as Deborah said, a lot of people don't think they're going to lose their freedom, but freedom is the exception, it's not the rule. Sometimes the process of losing it can be very gradual and incremental, so I want to very quickly summarize how I see the process. It starts with a process of self-censorship, as Deborah mentioned. We should have politically correct speech, sensitive speech, responsible speech. The next step is governments and institutions issue guidelines, and we are already way past there. I talked about this last year, and it's gotten way worse. Government agencies charged with fighting the war on terror have issued memos to intelligence professionals telling them don't use words like Islamic terrorism. Don't use words like jihad. And the National Security Strategy memo deletes all references to this. And in the most recent DHS counterterrorism report, they make a concerted effort to tell professionals to focus on the terrorist behavior and de-link it from the underlying ideology that motivates it. The next step is civil violations, and Canada is a good example of that. They have human rights commissions in every province that, on a regular and frequent basis, issue civil penalties to people who say negative things about Islam, even if they're not defaming an individual. They also act as parallel systems because Canada has a constitution that supposedly gives them free speech. And by the way, those commissions are here, they're starting here now. The last step in the process is to criminalize speech. And a lot of you might have followed the case of Dutch Member of Parliament Geert Wilders, who was recently charged with hate speech of Islam. And I think it's really interesting to note that the language in the Dutch Penal Code that the language that he was charged under is very, very similar to the language of this resolution. He was charged under, quote unquote, incitement to hatred language. The language that this State Department is saying is supposedly going to go away from defamation of religions to protecting individuals. He was acquitted, but the mere prosecution has a chilling effect on free speech. So in conclusion, I just want to say that the Founding Fathers drafted the First Amendment in part to protect offensive speech. The best way to counter bad ideas is with good ideas. It's very likely, in my view, that the OIC knows this, and that's why instead of arguing their views in the free marketplace of ideas, they seek to shut down the debate entirely. Combating defamation of religions is not a human right and actually stands in direct contradiction to real human rights. Only people should be afforded human rights. Ideas, religions, and policies should not get protection from criticism. And indeed, where you see religion that does get protection from criticism, you also see gross human rights violations, and it's no coincidence because free speech is the human right, not its restriction. In short, these resolutions harm free speech rights, they harm religious freedom rights, they harm human rights, they harm national security and terrorism prevention efforts. And finally, there are people who identify themselves as Muslim who are not in accord with the agenda of the OIC. However, the fact of the matter is the members of the OIC do fly planes into buildings, force little girls to get married, amputate people's limbs, and hang homosexuals in the public square. But if they can convince you that they are the victims of Islamophobia, rather than the perpetrators of a very dangerous ideology, then their proposed restrictions of free speech will do more harm to American freedom and national security than 9/11 ever could. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah Weiss.